we are joined by Dr. Samuel Sotios to discuss his article, Modern Psychology and the Loss of Transcendence. In this article, it discusses how modern psychology has taken a scientific stance that has almost completely cut itself off from any spiritual aspect that acknowledges the soul and mainly focuses on the workings of the mind. And the article also discusses how this can be detrimental to people who are seeking psychological treatment, as there are so many things that go deeper than just the processes of the mind. And the article discusses many different points in history and people who are from an array of different religions, such as Thomas Aquinas, Rumi, the Buddha, and all of the different aspects of believing that there is a soul and how this runs deeper and will lead to deeper transcendence. And today we're joined by Dr. Sotios to discuss his article, and we're all very excited to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I'll just jump in really quickly with one of the things I really took from this article is kind of a mapping in terms of the horizontal versus the vertical. I feel like that in modern psychology, we're often looking at things on a horizontal axis. So the world around us, the people around us. Even if we think about terms like mentalization and metacognition, I feel like we're stuck in the horizontal realm with this. What Dr. Sotias beautifully does is introduces the vertical realm here. And I really like the oceanic analogy in here in terms of the ocean above and the ocean below and that intermediary realm, which seems to be a very rich and robust realm for us to kind of delve into and further understand. I also had thought of the soul as a unified entity, a cohesive entity, and this article really fleshes it out in terms of a multidimensionality that I hadn't thought of before. So, as usual, a very thought-provoking article, beautifully written, and I'm curious to see what comes of the process. Floor is open.
I also, one of the things that I highlighted was the horizontal and the vertical aspects of looking at things. I saw something that discussed that a couple years ago, and it really changed like how I view like the process of life. And it was just really nice to kind of envision that like on a vertical line, like that's the here and now and like that's where everything exists. And I really appreciated you discussing that, especially from a psychological lens and how we're kind of conditioned to have a more horizontal view of things. I really liked that.
I think to go off of what I was saying, like about the focus on the horizontal, I think there were two parts that really spoke to me, but I think it was the fact that it was focusing on how modern psychology has focused too much on using its roots from Freudian of psychoanalysis. And then it kind of like the takeaway that I got was that it focused too much on progressing from that point, but never really letting go. And in a way, it kind of hinders our development into a more transcendence form where we are focused on the world around us, not necessarily anything of the soul and spiritual. And I think in order for us to move forward, we kind of had to let that go. Otherwise, we're not really evolving. We're just finding ways to stay true to psychoanalysis, but never moving past that. The other part too, which I'm going to quote it, that kind of spoke to me, was when we're referencing the English poet and Thomas Traherne. I hope I didn't butcher that. And I was saying, as my body without my soul is a carcass, so is my soul without thy spirit, a chaos, a dark, obscure heap of empty faculties, ignorant of itself, unsensible of thy goodness, blind to thy glory, dead in sins and trespass. And I'm just taking that part because for me personally, I think that, I believe in God and I respect everybody else's beliefs, but I kind of look at my life and some people I've had discussions where they go like, oh, why do you do it? For me, it just gives me a peace of mind and it does reflect who I am. A lot of the actions or the morals or values I do are surrounded around my belief system. So I think if that comes into play into mental health, you could look at new avenues about the person rather than just looking at the surface level.
I have a question. So is it assumed, just like based on like the conclusion of the article, that everyone is like broadly stems from a transcendent origin? Is that what's assumed in the um I guess in the paper and just in general?
Do you mean in terms of the human being originating in a transcendent origin?
Yes. We'll go with that. Like in therapy, are you assuming that the individual is from that transcendent origin that's like beyond themselves?
Yeah, so I think at the deepest or innermost level of the human being, I think that across the cultures, I think that's accurate, that we are not just psychophysical beings, and that what makes the body animated is the intermediary world, but the intermediary world of the soul or the psyche wouldn't be what it is without the spirit. So that's why I emphasize in here the tripartite structure of the human being, which includes the spirit, the soul, and the body. And and in a way, when it was mentioned the vertical and the horizontal way of understanding this, you could see the that taking place in the human being and the intersection in the heart, in the human heart. And that's why we can look at the faculty, the highest faculty in the human being is the intellect with a capital I. So I know in psychology we talk about intellectualization, which we can bypass difficult emotions or not look at ourselves or the other person or what's going on. But intellect here is synonymous with spirit. So it's a direct apprehension. And so that intersection is in the human heart, or what they call the eye of the heart. So that's where the intellectus in Latin, or ruh in Arabic, there's different terms for it, but that's the faculty of direct seeing, direct apprehension of reality with unmediated by the senses. So in a sense, the vertical and the horizontal um, come together in the human heart, and that's what allows us to experience the world and reality. And that's what we talk about when we mention immanence. I saw some kind of dialogue back and forth between transcendence and immanence. And so here we have in this article that modern psychology has severed itself from anything higher. And modern psychology usually talks about going inside, the inner, but we can't access, to use a DBT term, wise mind, right? Wise mind in us. Wise mind has to exist outside of us in the transcendent for us to be able to activate or utilize it within us. And DBT, all of the different models, I think psychosynthesis, comes somewhat close, but still outside a spiritual tradition, we don't have there's no agency within us to actually do anything if we think about it. And so our framework in psychology is severely lacking if we think about it in those terms. I know we take everything for granted and we make up new terms and new theories, but this is what I'm trying to highlight here. If we're really trying to figure out what's going on here, we think that we can do, but where's that doing coming from? And then in traditional cultures, it was always contemplation before action or activity. And we've got that totally upside down. So we, just to use DBT, because everyone, it seems in the study group is practicing DBT or is aware of it. It's part of one of the framework. So we can't really activate wise mind in a full or complete way without transcendence. And so if let's say if transcendence is online, so to speak, if we're practicing within a framework where we can access transcendence, then wise mind comes online and we can inform our day-to-day, moment-to-moment, some would surmise, activities through wise mind. So we can establish contemplation, and then that preceding all activity in our lives, conversations, therapy sessions, just our experience as human beings.
I like how that can add some nuance and depth to a DBT skill like stop, which I kind of view as a very action oriented, maybe even an acute action, whereas contemplation, I think, adds a little bit of space to it and breadth to it and softness to it, which oftentimes the DBT skills are lacking. I just want to speak about DBT. The glaring hole in DBT is we're operating, from a biosocial model. There is no biopsychosocial model, much less a biopsycho-spiritual soul assessing social model. So Abigail and I were discussing a little bit what that might look like in terms of an assessment tool, and we weren't able to come to any conclusions. But great question, Mark.
Yeah, somewhat kind of bouncing off of that, I feel like some modes of therapy use, meditation, mindfulness, gratitude. In my opinion, those are somewhat spiritual concepts, but they're kind of reframed in more scientific terms. I feel like psychology needs to be more open, obviously, to spiritual wisdom to kind of regain that transcendence instead of, dismissing it as weird or irrational. I think we're so used to this biological approach after all of these years that I think it's almost become like a stereotype or a stigma that anything beyond it is, weird or abnormal. So it makes me wonder, like, what can we actually do to make therapies more spiritually driven and less scientific, or bare minimum, find a 50-50 even balance because we're so drawn to this biological scientific approach.
I personally think it's being open to conversation. I'm quite spiritual myself, and I've got quite a few friends that are spiritual, like a mutual thing we've got. And before therapy, we all had the conversation of, God, if you mention anything spiritual or unknown like the UFO, you're just going to be labeled even more crazy. So it's like an unspoken thing of we don't talk about it in case it gets labeled, because once it's labeled, unfortunately it sticks with you. So everyone's a bit hush about it. But I think if you've got a good connection with a one-to-one therapist, and you get the feeling that their spiritual say a few things that you think, oh, that's kind of, I can integrate with that, and then just see what happens and go with the process. But yeah, there's definitely like a unspoken thing with people where we try not to get into that conversation because you never know what's going to stick with you.
I think kind of building off of that and off of what Morgan said, I think the reason it's looked at as so abnormal is because in theory, there's a set of guidelines that someone can follow, whereas spirit, there's no set of guidelines and it's kind of just you're learning through yourself. There's no way to mend a spirit. You can't mend someone else's spirit. It's an individual thing. All you can do is help guide someone. So I feel like a lot of people stray away from that just because there's no stern set of guidelines that is like, oh, yes, this is what I could do to help my spiritual side. I think it's so taboo for so many people because of a thing like that.
And furthermore, to bounce off of that, I'm taking a specialization at my university in transpersonal psychology. The number of students in my class, I feel going into that sort of specialty is pretty low. And I don't know if that's an acceptance of transpersonal psychology, which is, of course, they call it soul work. I don't know how Western medicine is embracing what we're talking about right now and what the trends are, but that is something that I feel is a passion of mine. And so I am going to take that specialization. And I wanted to say, Dr. Sotios, that this article was exactly what I needed. So thank you very much for that.
I think I also love trying to connect these more conceptual insights back to, okay, from this, what are the practical applications? And honestly, the only thing I can think of is being aware of our blind spots and acknowledging that our ideas of health and healing are non-comprehensive. And as much as I would love to know everything in depth about all of the cultures and methods of healing across the world, spirituality, I unfortunately don't have a long enough lifetime for that. And a lot of the time when I was reading this, I kept coming back to a more anthropological perspective of like the meaning response, and not only its existence, but its significance. I mean, I think in Western medicine and as a result, psychiatry and psychology, we really are so focused on corporeal healing. Even the concept of the placebo effect. I mean, we put so much faith in molecules and interventions, and the fact that the placebo effect can even exist is significant. What people hold significance in and where they get a sense of self-efficacy from, that makes a difference. And I think validating that and being aware that what we believe and practice through our inevitable lens and bias of Western medicine and the medical model is not all that there is. That's not the only truth.
Yeah, to go off that, I was also like, I agree with you, everything you said, but I was also thinking of like the practical use of like what can we do to change this? And like similar to you, I was thinking like, let's just say we have the DBT framework, like in the middle we have transcendence, right? Because that's like what that from what I like read and like what I'm like learning is that it like that can help an individual like understand the meaning, seeking meaning, and like their own willpower. So I guess what I'm like kind of asking and trying to wrap my head around is this will like especially help individuals like understand that things are out of their control and being directly moved by, I guess, like the emotions of like the world around them and like the higher power and like I guess centering to understanding that there's more than just them.
This makes me think of my dissertation, Lauren, where we view DBT as monolithic, and it's anything but. There's 4 levels of DBT, and there's exhaustive research on stage 1 and stage 2. It falls off after stage 3 and stage 4. I studied stage 4, advanced DBT, which there's no research on. And what came out very beautifully was some spiritual themes. Now, more research is indicated, but I was really blown away by that. I almost feel like we view these models as linear, like these stages, when really we should be viewing them as more circular. Even if we're in a stage 1 treatment, yes, we're putting out fires, we're trying to keep patients alive, and always kind of keeping an eye out. Are there entry points to bring in some more spiritually or capital I, heart-centered work or soul-filled work? Because if we do get too caught up in the clinical behaviorism of it, I almost feel like it becomes soulless.
Yeah, I think I appreciate all of the comments and wrestling with the ideas because it's so helpful to hear where people are coming from and how they conceptualize the use or implementation of these ideas. I think that we also forget about the centrality of the person providing the services, the psychotherapist. Our presence in the room has a tremendous impact. And so rather than coming in with worry and fear about what we're going to do, you know, what about being there and being ultimately vulnerable and centered in the experience? And with this framework, see where we're called to kind of move per the person that we're working with, you know, so we can have a framework that we're operating from. And I think we discussed a little bit in the last conversation, the general ingredients that I spoke about, the 3 facets or 3 dimensions. The intermediary is coupled with, you know, the corporeal and the spirit above it, which adds efficacy to the other 2 domains. So we can come in and we can have this very expansive framework, whatever that framework is, hopefully it's guided by something that has an ontological framework where we can include all of what we are as human beings. And then from there, see what emerges, you know? And I think that was one of the boons of humanistic existential work and Gestalt is really being there in the moment and seeing what emerges. And I know Fritz Perls was very much influenced by Zen practice and moment to moment awareness that comes from these spiritual traditions. So I think a lot has been written, you know, within the humanistic and transpersonal, but I think it's also looking at perhaps where we can incorporate this more expansive framework, which is returning the discipline to its more spiritual roots. You know, if we think about the discipline only being 500 years old, well, what was happening before that? And then what was happening all throughout the world? Why is it only that in the modern West that we came up with psychology? Well, if you really, you know, think about it, it was more of a wrong turn rather than a positive, because around the world, our understanding of the human mind, consciousness, the soul, the inner dimension is all rooted in the cultural practices. And so it was really in the West where that was lost, you know, through the events of the Renaissance and no longer turning to the celestial forms and just focusing in on the human forms. The human is human because of what is above it, and it completes it, not on its own terms. And the Renaissance forgot about that. And then, of course, we have the revolutions in science that took place, and then the Enlightenment project, which Freud is very much a representative of. And since then, the discipline hasn't been a science of the soul. It hasn't included the intermediary in its fullest sense or the transcendent.
I also too just want to highlight this is still bifurcated. You don't hear transpersonal psychology mentioned on the East Coast. We have a saturation of psychoanalytic institutes, so we're talking Freud. However, I'm not going to be included with we because I feel like I'm a West Coast soul and an East Coast body sometimes, but we oftentimes are like, oh, that's a West Coast thing. That belongs out in Naropa and Saybrook University and now in California. So I just want to highlight that blind spot. Dr. Sotios, I'm really interested. Where do you see this in an increasingly techno-industrialized time? Now that we're kind of in this wave of techno-industrialism, how does this loss of transcendence and how do we regain it or move at least incrementally to regain this in an increasingly techno-industrial time?
I think that globally there's going to be more and more interest in this because it's such a stabilizing force. And the more that we have cultures, you know, intermingling and we're seeing people come into therapy that are from completely different worlds than we're from, we're going to have to learn more about how other people see the world, you know, what their paradigms are, how they understand consciousness, you know, what does it mean to be centered and balanced and whole. And I think it's going to push us, you know, to return back to more stabilizing paradigms. I think that the technology that we're moving, you know, hurtling, you know, so quickly into has a lot of drawbacks, and a lot of people are very concerned about what those drawbacks are. So I think that this is going to be more and more important as we go, and I think that it's a really ripe cultural moment when so much chaos is kind of in our midst. And we're going to see the importance of trying to be sane in an insane context. And many times the people that we're working with in therapy, while they might have early childhood traumas, they're oftentimes responding to the world around them that is completely off center.
Sometimes when I'm walking around the city of Philadelphia, I was walking around on a particularly beautiful day last spring, and everyone was on their cell phones, heads down. And I started to think, wow, this is a new form of prayer. This is the new form of contemplation. So perhaps we can bow our heads to a non-digitalized form. So Deepa, you had a question in the chat. I invite you to bring it in here.
Yeah, I It was just kind of something that came up in my head while I was reading it. I was particularly drawn to the connection to religion in this article. I grew up both Christian and Hindu, so I had very different perspectives on spiritual growth and spirituality, going to church and also the temple. And with more exposure to learning about different cultures, the way people express spirituality, and articles like this, I've realized that it's a there's a pretty common foundation for spirituality in religions, and kind of bringing back what Morgan and Nico were talking about. I just thought that that's what to me makes the implementation of spiritual growth and therapy in the psychology field more feasible in a way, because I think it leaves room for all of us to be interconnected even across like different spiritual beliefs. So I just wanted to make that comment before we end off. Yeah.
If I may, what's really fascinating, if we were to all take a plane right now and land in Delhi or somewhere in the Indian, subcontinent, and we enrolled in a psychology program, what do you think the dominant paradigm? How would they be teaching us about mental health and the discipline?
I do think that they would take a much more spiritual and religious take to it. I think they would emphasize spirituality. Meditation and yoga is a very big thing in India, and I do think that that's the biggest focus. Like my mom, she goes to therapy and she has an Indian therapist, and I realize that they focus a lot on meditation and yoga rather than the very scientific standpoint that we have here in the United States.
Yeah, I was just making that point because my experience is having a very diverse classroom um, and asking people from different parts of the world, did you ever learn about the psychology of your own culture in the classroom setting? And they said, no, I didn't even know that it exists. The Hindu psychology, I had no idea. Jain psychology, Buddhist psychology, Sikh psychology, indigenous forms of psychology that exist in India. Of course, Christian psychology exists. It's kind of a very developed, but it's just interesting wherever you go in the world, the kind of the operative paradigm is what you mean is modern Western psychology. That's why I emphasize that because in the pre-modern West, uh, that was very different. It was all of the kind of understanding of the soul was rooted in the Christian tradition, um, so that it looks different in modernity and post-modernity. But yeah, thank you. And just to say, last thing is about that is that when I use the word spiritual, I mean the inner dimension of religion. So the mystical or the esoteric. And so, because religion is so off-putting, I often use spiritual, the term spiritual, but that isn't just a flimsy term. It's within each of the world's religions, there's an inner dimension. It was mentioned Meister Eckhart, Rumi, these great representatives, Shankaracharya of India. And India is interesting because Hinduism doesn't really have the inner dimension because it doesn't really need it. The metaphysics is just plain and simple. But with the Abrahamic monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the inner dimension is really important to point out because it looks very hard and authoritarian or dogmatic. And with the mystics, that honored the fullness of the tradition by honoring the inner dimension, we can get a glimpse of how they can be more therapeutic and less about rules and dogma. Those things are important and part of the tradition, but it's not the whole of it.
Hi, Dr. Stias. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. So I had a question sort of building off of what a lot of other people had mentioned earlier on in the conversation in terms of the applicability of this. I know that you work as a psychotherapist yourself, and I would be curious to hear, it sounds like this is something that, really drives a lot of your work and your understanding of psychology and ourselves. So I'm curious how you incorporate this into your actual work with your clients, both on a macro scale, I guess, in terms of how the values and the principles behind it guide the work that you do, and also on a more micro acute scale of what types of interventions or techniques, strategies you use that are sort of influenced by these ideas.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question that I often get, and I struggle with it at times because it really depends on the person coming in, for services and what they're looking for and what they bring in. And so sometimes, and I think I mentioned this last time we all met, is that sometimes the person has their faith right there in the forefront. Sometimes they're very open about that, and sometimes they're reluctant to mention it because of the negative feedback that they've received, especially from other therapists or psychiatrists, participating in their delusions or psychotic contents in their mind. So it really depends what they bring in. But I try to hold them, whatever person I work with, in the broadest possible context, and then really key in or hone into the moment. And then through speaking with them, through sensing, where things, could move along, per their, statements, their body language, then I try to move with them and figure out, what's meaningful, and try to go from there. I mean, for some people, they want to blame everything on the things around them, and then it comes back to them that it was really their misinterpretation of their life because they didn't see how they were being challenged or tested, and it related back to their faith. Others don't want to look at their lives, and they just want to focus on their faith, and so they kind of want to not look at the darker aspects of the things that are taking place in them. So that requires a different kind of intervention. Well, actually, no, just because you have a faith doesn't mean you need to gloss over the way that you treat your neighbors or your children. So it all depends on the person and what's arising. Some feel that they had to leave because they were traumatized by their own faith. Their parents were in a cult or something very, a religious context which was very painful for them. They didn't know how to fit in growing up with others, and it's trying to understand that process and then maybe find another way to relate to their culture, their faith traditions. So it really depends. There isn't kind of an ingredient, like a cooking card, that I could just present where you could just whip up the same meal. It's really so dependent on the moment and what's emerging. We take ourselves to be human, but in the diverse cultures of the world, we're not complete beings. We need to participate in the sacred and live our lives in that context to live in this temporal world and then meet the next world. So when I say the largest framework is the one that acknowledges the fullness of what it means to be a human being, and the mental health system has more or less forgotten that.
And just to dovetail a little bit off that, I think that is one of the principles that I try and teach you, in terms of, we can get so caught up in terms of how did the past influence this, right? Or where are we headed at in the future in terms of administering therapy protocols. Most of what you need to provide effective therapy is where? It's in the here and now. I know you were just about to say that, Anna. It's in the moment. It's in that therapeutic edge that I referred to, that is continually unfolding in this sometimes disjointed, and then sometimes absolutely synced up and rhythmic, choreographed dance of empathy that is therapy. So, Dr. Sotios, anything in closing?
In the modern West, many of the people that we come to see are very much hypercerebral, and they're suffering very much from just ruminating with idea upon idea, listening to podcasts, watching things, ad nauseum. And it's very difficult for them to sit in the room and come back just to sensing their left foot, for example, and the large toe on their left foot. Oftentimes they need to think about that. There isn't direct access to sensing the left foot and the large toe there. I know it seems benign, but if we're not centered in the sensory experience and being fully in what is emerging moment to moment, it's very difficult to know who the other person is, or to determine what their needs are, or respond with anything that we've learned, throughout our lives or our study of the discipline of psychology. So we really need to, I think, to emphasize coming out of the head. And I know this seems like very intellectual, and I say that in the normative sense, not intellectus with the capital I. And while it can be a lot of information, it's not necessarily about the information, but it's about the perspective and the now.
As a closing thought, I'll just say we're all about AI and tech in mental health. I am increasingly becoming aware, and this is my own thing. I think we may need to return to the analog. I think we may need to take a step back from the screens, put them down, and perhaps start spinning vinyl records again. So, Dr. Satia, such an honor and privilege. Thank you for sharing this time with us, and everyone, thank you for contributing to a beautiful process today.